Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. The theme of today's video, we're going to be unpacking the whole concept of knees out versus knees in a squat. I think that also leads to some really interesting conversations about squat technique, injury prevention, the whole idea of the midfoot knee valgus and whether or not that's a risk factor for injury, and then whether or not that's actually what we're seeing when people's knees come in a squat. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to wrap it up by just covering my squat technique triad, the three things that are of the utmost importance if you want to optimize your squat technique and squat big weights. Before we dive into that, I just want to remind you guys that if you want to learn my entire training system for developing world-class strength and conditioning plans, you can check that out down below. We've got a full pre-recorded curriculum, but you also get lifetime access, not just to the course content, but to me through a Discord. And there's also 3 live video calls a week where the entire community hops on a 1-hour Zoom call a couple of times a week and just asks questions about the application of the content or just anything else that they need help with in their coaching journey. All right, so let's get into it. Where did these sort of competing ideas of knees out in a squat versus knees in actually come from? So when it comes to the knees out squat technique, I think that really its legacy evolved out of old school powerlifting where, everyone was obsessed with opening the hips. And generally, I think the thought process was that if you wanted to maximize your squat, you had to maximize the contribution of the hips, and knee extensors or quadriceps were kind of an afterthought. And so outside of early powerlifting, it really was Dr. Kelly Starrett that was the main spokesperson for this knees out cue. And it wasn't really a performance-based thing. It was more just based around the idea of injury prevention. If the knees move inward, which everyone referred to as a valgus movement, and we're going to unpack that, is all knees in a squat, even knee valgus. Even if it is knee valgus, do you need to worry about it from an injury prevention perspective? But yeah, Kelly Starrett was obsessed with this idea that you had to avoid knee valgus or any medial travel of the knee, because then that would just lead to knee injuries or knee pain down the line. And if you were around for the early CrossFit peak Dr. Kelly Starrett knees out era, this wasn't just a little bit of outward knee movement. It was like knees out as hard as you can, like knees well out past the pinky toe. And even though these ideas emerged well over a decade ago, just because people are very slow to update their ideas and their thinking about training in this industry, you still see a lot of these really exaggerated knees out squats to this day. Now, knees in squats, it's something that a lot of people end up doing kind of naturally when they're grinding out really hard squats. You see a lot of medial travel of the knees moving in towards the midline. The first time I heard someone talk about it as though it was a positive thing was Dr. Pat Davidson. I think Pat Davidson is an absolute legend of the game when it comes to strength training and I guess the implementation of a lot of ideas that are associated with the gait cycle. I think I came across Pat Davidson's Knees In for the Win article on squats sometime around late 2018 or maybe early 2019. And it was the first time I heard someone discuss medial knee travel as something that could improve the performance of squats, or just this idea that it wasn't inherently injurious and maybe something that we should be letting happen or even leaning into when it comes to our squat. Pat's sort of central thesis for why medial knee travel could be a favorable thing in a squat sort of stemmed from this idea of coupled joint actions in the gait cycle when we're producing a lot of force through mid stance, whether it be walking or sprinting or something like that. We typically see these coupled actions through mid stance. You see a lot of pronation, dorsiflexion, and internal rotation of both the tibia and the femur. I think it's a really interesting thing to bring up these coupled joint actions. Again, pronation of the foot. If you're not super familiar with the idea of pronation or even supination, I'll use my broken little foot model to give you a demonstration. So pronation is when the arch of the foot is flattened out and on the ground. And then supination is when the midfoot sort of has that nice big arch in it. And so going back to this whole idea of trying to avoid Kelly Starrett cue of knees out, trying to avoid knee valgus in squats because he thought it was injurious or gonna cause people all this pain in their knees. Knee valgus is a very specific movement. It's not all medial knee travel, or just because your knees move towards your midline doesn't mean that you're experiencing a knee valgus, or I would say more often than not, you're probably not going into knee valgus in the context of a squat. And so what knee valgus is specifically, we're really dipping into the skeletons in my closet today. I don't have a knee joint, but I've got the bottom half of a tibia and I've got the top half of a femur. So I'm just going to demonstrate this really crudely. Biomechanics geeks, please put away your flaming torches for a second. So what valgus is specifically is internal rotation, or your femur or thigh bone rotating inwards towards your midline, and then your tibia or your shin bone rotating outwards, rotating in opposite directions. But more often than not, when we see people's knees moving inward in a squat, when you look at it from the ground up, typically what we're seeing is this symphony of internal rotation and not actual knee valgus. So what do I mean by that? So when we have a foot that's pronating, again, that's its own form of internal rotation or movement in towards the midline, the arch dropping down, we're getting more pressure through the inside edge of the foot. And typically what we see coupled with that is internal rotation of the tibia, not external rotation. So we get pronation of a foot, internal rotation of the tibia, as the femur is also internally rotating. So everything is just rotating inwards towards the midline together. You're not actually getting this valgus action. Now, I'm not saying that knee valgus never happens. I'm sure there are some people that are arching their foot, rotating their tibia bone out as their femur bone rolls in. But when you look at all the research on knee valgus, it's not really on people squatting or even just doing low velocity movements. It's often extraordinarily high velocity or deceleration movements in the sporting field, a lot more chaotic, and often on, like I said, just moving at high speeds and landing on one leg. That's when you actually see valgus. Then there's all this other emerging evidence that's sort of saying, well, even in high velocity movements, we're probably seeing knee valgus after the ACL is already snapped and broken off. And anyway, going back to squats where you're on two legs and you're moving at much lower velocities, I really don't think valgus is, one, I don't think valgus is even happening most of the time. And two, even if it was, it just doesn't seem to be much of a risk factor. Squats in the gym are so much safer than going out and playing sport and doing really aggressive deceleration in a chaotic environment. At this point in the video, I should probably come clean and say that I do have a bit of an emotional bias against coaches that are obsessed with this knees out cue. And this sort of stems from a belief or a worldview that I have that the human body is incredibly adaptable, and you should not come up with a cueing system based on fear of injury or stress on the body. You just need to sort of progress your loads over time, and especially low velocity activities like lifting weights, like you're gonna be pretty safe. 50% of the logic why most coaches advocate for this knees out technique is like, oh, don't do knees in, that'll hurt you. It's not any idea of like, oh, one's better for performance than the other. Often coaches who coach this really knees out version of a squat, the other thing that they cue their lifters to do, which never made any sense to me, is to arch the hell out of their foot, really trying to avoid any form of pronation or flattening of the arch. This never made any sense to me because it's not really controversial at all to suggest that when you're squatting, deadlifting, or anything where you're trying to produce a lot of force, you want to be putting most of your pressure through the midfoot. Like, this is the midfoot to me. I don't know, maybe it's different to other people, but when you have a big arch in your foot, your midfoot's not on the ground. Whereas when you're in this more pronated foot shape, well, then your midfoot is really pushing into the ground. So it's weird because, again, all the coaches were like, knees out, arch your foot, but stay on your midfoot. And it's like, how am I meant to stay on my midfoot when it's off the ground because you've told me to arch the hell out of my foot? Anyway, we won't dive down the whole foot and ankle thing. Let's try to keep this mostly centered around the knees. I mean, I've already done a bad job of that, but hopefully you'll appreciate the context. And so me as a lifter who, sort of tried the knees out cue, but whenever squats got really hard, my knees would move in towards the midline more, and it never bothered my knees at all. Like, if anything, it was just a really strong position that helped me make a lot of my heavy squats. So it was really validating seeing this knees out cue getting popularized by coaches like Pat Davidson, or again, I think we should sort of discuss, I'm not even sure that Pat Davidson would necessarily cue knees in, and it's not something that I do with any of my athletes as well. I think it's just about focusing on going up and down and then just sort of letting your knees do what they want, but having this expectation that in a heavy squat, especially on the way up, you're probably going to see some knee movement in towards the midline, because it sort of seems to be what humans do when we produce force. We pronate our feet and things move in towards your midline. It's this sort of compressive action of the body. This idea that you're gonna spread yourself when the squat's getting hardest, it doesn't feel like good for a lot of people. And so with all the fear mongering of, oh, knees in, oh, you don't want to go into knee valgus, then you're going to damage your knees, it created these squats in a lot of people where they were shoving their knees so far out, like way outside their pinky toe, that it created this self-fulfilling prophecy of these violent medial knee swings midway through squats, because people were just pushing their knees out into such an unrealistic position to maintain that they then had so much space to come in. A lot of the time, if you just, like I said, just focus on going down and up, which is the main thing you should be focusing on in a squat, you don't experience nearly as much medial knee travel because the knees are much closer in to begin with. There's going to be people who watch this video and they're like, oh, so you're saying if my knees touch each other on the way up, that's a good squat? And I don't think that's necessarily ideal either. I mean, we see it in high level squatters. Was it Leah Bavoli? Her knees basically touch on the way up in her squat. But a lot of the time, what you sort of see when the knees come in a squat, especially if you maintain good foot pressure and even pressure through the whole foot, you see the knees just line up with the big toe, and you actually get that joint stacking that a lot of coaches are after. It's weird. I think a lot of coaches, they sort of see knees in as a shift away from stacking of the joints. And again, that's a whole nother conversation to unpack, whether it's necessary to stack your joints to produce the most force. But anyway, for the purposes of this conversation, let's pretend it's a good thing. A lot of people end up with much more stacked ankles, knees, and hips when their knees lined up with their big toe, not when their knees shoved way outside. And like I said, a lot of those people, then when they do have to produce a lot of force, the knees swing in, not just to the big toe, but just all the way. There's just such a big shift in the momentum of the knees. And now I'm not saying that all coaches who promote this knees out style of squatting are fearmongers who are limiting your squat performance. My good friend Thomas Lilly, he coaches a lot of the strongest squatters in the world, and he's a real big fan of sort of twisting the quads out. He doesn't cue knees out. I actually prefer the way Thomas Lilly cues it, because I think the way he cues it, just with this twisting your quads out as you initiate the squat, you're not going to end up with this absurd Kelly Starrett style knees out squat. You're just going to end up with, just open hips. And it works really well for him and all his athletes. I think he has pretty much a universal technical model that he applies to all his lifters. Me personally, I like the knees in squat. It's a little bit edgy, but really what I like is just telling people to focus on maintaining pressure on their midfoot, getting a good brace, and just going down and up, and the knees are going to do their thing. And it's really rare that you see much outward or inward movement of the knees when people squat like this. Like I said, the squat is mostly about going down and up. I just don't think you should be thinking about your frontal or transverse plane that much. So that's my squat technique triad. It's bar placement, which, it's pretty straightforward. It's just, if you're doing a high bar squat, put it across your traps. If you're doing a low bar squat, it's across your rear delts. If you're doing a front squat or a zercher squat, against collarbones or elbows. And choosing your bar placement kind of comes down to your goals or your preferences for what sort of squat you like. The next thing you want to think about is stance width. So how wide or how narrow you put your feet, and we can include in that like your toe angle, how much you want to turn your feet out. And this is entirely individual based on your limb lengths, your strengths and weaknesses, and honestly just personal preference. And then the other thing you need to focus on for a good squat is your bracing. You need to find a way to make your torso as rigid as possible for a squat, because that's going to help you transmit as much force through your legs, or from the ground through your legs, all the way up into the bar, because the force has a fair bit of distance to travel there. And a lot of people sort of get these energy leakages when their torso starts to change shape throughout a squat. So again, choose a bar placement, figure out what stance width and toe angle works for you, learn to brace really hard, and they're the big three that you need to focus on for a really nice, strong, and safe squat. All right, just before we wrap this video up, I want to remind you guys, if you want to learn my entire strength and conditioning system, again, there's a whole unit on human movement in the curriculum. Check out the links down below. Great opportunity to learn from me. Like I said, we've got a free week trial of the 3 or 5 day GPP team training program if you want to give that a go. Hope you guys have some good squats this week. I hope you found this insightful. Hopefully it clarified why some coaches are so obsessed with knees out, why some coaches might be cueing knees in, even though I think that that's an overcorrection and a mistake in and of itself. Just let your knees be knees. Happy squatting, and I'll talk to you in a couple of days.